of Coalition S, with Coalition S as their head of strategy. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with sort of Plan S and Coalition S, but one of the things we've been keen to do is ensure that we support a variety of business models. We're fully agnostic on business models, and therefore we support publishers, whether they are fully open access publishers or more traditional subscription publishers, trying to find ways in which they can fully support the principles of Plan S. And one of the things we recognized early on was that there's a growing trend towards these big sort of read and publish like agreements, but they tend to be focused very much on the very big players, the Elsevier's of the world, the Wileys of the world, and so forth, and a sense that the smaller independent or society publishers find it more difficult to get a seat at the table. So we, Coalition S, in partnership with ALPSP, have funded a couple of studies, which we're grateful for Information Power, Lorraine and Alicia to lead on. And the second report we did effectively again concluded that the smaller society publishers, independent publishers, still found it quite challenging to develop these transitional open access agreements. And that one practical way forward, and we're very keen to get sort of actionable items from these reports, was to try and develop cross-stakeholder engagement and cross-stakeholder alignment that would enable smaller independent publishers, society publishers, to transition to open access. So that was what the report came out in June 2021 said. So next slide, please, Alicia. So given that and a need to make things actionable, we set up 4 working groups to try and understand the challenges and say try and come up with practical, actionable items. This work, as I've said, was funded in partnership with Coalition S, but also with ALPSP. And the groups we established were, so we're keen that they were represented all stakeholders. So therefore, by definition, it include libraries, library consortia, small independent publishers, and intermediaries. And that's something I'll come back to in a moment. But if we have the next slide, please. So and you're going to be hearing more from the chairs of each of these task and finish groups, but the work was around developing shared principles, trying to get some example or exemplar agreements. So you could take an agreement as a starting point, tweak it obviously to your heart's content, but at least you wouldn't start with a blank sheet of paper. A data template, try and work out what data a library would like and what data a publisher could provide. And then for the focus of a lot of today's session is trying to make that workflow as seamless and complete as possible. So huge thanks to those 4 task and finish groups, which took on a huge undertaking, which you'll hear more. And my final slide for today, for this afternoon, we're really pleased. I mean, as speaking on behalf of Coalition S, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of Wayne at ALPSP on this issue, we're really pleased with the way that the stakeholders, the different stakeholders, have come together with this shared goal to try and make it easier for these smaller independent publishers to participate in agreements which enable them to transition. And as I hinted at a moment ago, there's a lot of moving parts here. And really to try and ensure that these outputs are actionable, we really need to try and develop, try and make sure that the workflows are automated as possible. And that's why the intermediaries we speak about earlier are so important in this space. So with that, I just thank you again for your active participation. And I'm going to hand back to Lorraine, who will introduce the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. Well, before I hand over to the chairs of our wonderful task and finish groups, I just want to give a short call out to all the people who have really contributed to this project. And they have worked amazingly over quite a short period and given up so many hours. Our steering group for the project, all the members are listed here. And we have really benefited by their oversight of the project and also their great advice that they've given us along the way. So thank you very much, steering group. I know quite a few are on the call today. I won't read everyone out because it would take too long, but you can see we had a real cross-section of people join us. And as Robert said, our working groups have done really, really fantastic work. You will meet the chairs. We don't unfortunately have time today to introduce you to every member of the task and finish groups, but you can see them all listed here. As Robert said, we've had contributions in these groups from libraries, library consortia, publishers, and some intermediaries as well. So you will now hear a little bit about the fruits of their work and the outputs that we have as a result of that work. So I'm going to hand over to Rod Cookson, who chaired our Shared Principles Task and Finish group, and he is going to tell you about that group and about its outputs. So if I may, over to you, Rod.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lorraine. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. My name's Rod Cookson. I'm Managing Director of IWA Publishing. We're a learned society who publish 15 completely open access journals in water science. And as Lorraine has just said, I'm also the chair of the Shared Principles Task and Finish group. As Robert mentioned, the goal of this project is to simplify the making of transformative agreements for smaller and independent publishers, accelerating their transition to open access. An implicit part of this project is to reduce the amount of work needed by librarians, consortia, and publishers to produce transformative agreements. We convened a group of key stakeholders to agree principles for this project in a series of meetings in September and October 2021. The group included 14 librarians, consortia managers, funders, and publishers from across 3 continents. Between us, we sought common ground on which all parties could agree and which will be the basis for simplified, streamlined agreements in future. Discussion was often lively and passionate, with frank explanation of what each stakeholder needed and why specific points mattered. It was a highly educational and very enjoyable process. And as an aside, I would say that I believe this kind of multi-stakeholder discussion to be an incredibly productive way of engaging with new developments in our field. And I'd also like to thank everyone who participated in this particular task and finish group again for their valuable input into the project. We ended up with 20 principles for transformative agreements organized under 2 headings: pricing and cost allocation principles and licensing. Our intention throughout has been to find a balance between the needs of all stakeholders and make discussions faster and easier. Hopefully, we've achieved that. The finished principles were then passed on to the task and finish groups to translate our ideas into practical, useful tools designed for use in the real world. With that, I will hand over to Claire Moulton from the company of Biologists, who can talk about the data template task and finish group and explain how that worked and what that group achieved.
Thank you, Rod. So yes, I'm Claire Moulton. I'm the publisher at the company of Biologists, and the remit for our group was to devise a data template for use in the negotiation of open access agreements. So as with the other groups, it was really important that this was a collaboration between multiple partners. So with the librarians and independent publishers coming together. An early note was that publishers are doing a lot of manual work to combine the data and to present for agreement negotiations. And then librarians are following up by checking all of that data. So an awful lot of manual work going into it. We decided that we'd get wider input through a community survey. So we felt it was important to get a good indication that we'd be able to get buy-in from both publishers and librarians to move forward with this data template. So given the idea that there was a pain point in putting together these data, we tried to start with a very simple data template with just the current subscription fees, a DOI for each article by institution and year, and the APC paid for each article, if any. And when we went out with that idea, publishers, of course, were very keen on that. They did confirm the pain of putting these data together. But the librarians came back to us and said, no, actually, there is more data that we require for these negotiations. So we then looked at the survey results and we took the top data requirements from more than 40% of respondents. And at that point, the team actually very quickly came to a consensus about what should be in the table. So you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to run through every data point in the table, but I'm going to do a special shout out to persistent identifiers, PIDs. We've made the DOI essential. The orchid is desirable and will be essential if an official institutional email address is not available. The funder ID is desirable, and we will need an organisation identifier, ideally the ROR. So we did discuss whether these PIDs should all be required, but we were concerned that the current systems being used don't necessarily provide these in an easy fashion, so some of them have remained optional. Publishers should also note that many librarians don't consider any license other than CC BY to be open access, so we've included license type in this model, and we also included the business model for the journal, which is of interest to the library, but we limited the options here to being open access, hybrid, or subscription, rather than considering a lot of variations on hybrid status. Next slide, Alicia. So we do see this data template being useful for smaller independent publishers to present proposals, to present renewal proposals, and to report on agreements, and being useful to libraries and consortia in evaluating offers and comparing offers from different publishers. I will just mention that one key challenge emerged that we decided that we couldn't fix by the introduction of a data template, and that is the difficulty that all stakeholders have in handling the open access arrangements for articles with multiple corresponding authors from multiple institutions. For example, under which agreement might that fall? So we haven't solved everything, but we do hope that we've produced a useful data template that will then be used by the communities in real open access negotiations. So I'm going to finish by just another call for that automation, better linking between systems, and particularly the use of the persistent identifiers to help us track that data all the way through the data points. Back to you, Rod.
And actually, I think we're going to hand over to Celeste Feathers now from Lyrasis, who chaired the working group on the example of OA agreements.
Great, so thank you very much, Alicia. As the licensing group's conversation progressed over the course of the past several months, we came to the realization that there's a continuum of detail and complexity in the world of open access journal business models that really does require a parallel set of documentation along that same continuum, with the models on the left side shown here to require mostly essential documentation with basic information and no detailed data tracking or institutional reports. Comparatively, then, on the right side of the continuum are the models that require more detailed documentation, setting forth the tracking, reporting, and payment requirements to support the models. And we arrived at this realization through many hours of conversation and back and forth about where everything fit into the greater picture of open access journal business models. So in the end, rather than create model licenses for any of these rapidly evolving models in this space, we decided to offer sample documents that libraries and consortia and publishers can adapt as they need to meet their local situations, as Robert mentioned earlier, and these documents can fit then with the requirements of their specific environments. We often hear about new variations on these early models, and of course the agreement language will likely continue to evolve along with the changes to the models themselves. So on the essential end of the continuum, we find the open access models that gather funds from the community to support foreign open access publications, and Diamond OA programs here are a good example. In many cases, an agreement that just specifies the amount of the funding, the time period, and what the publisher will provide with the funds is enough to work with the procurement procedure and offices of the institutions and facilitate the payment of an invoice. Some of you may be familiar with the Shared E-Resources Understanding, or SIRU, documentation that is a recommended best practice by the National Information Standards Organization in the United States. SIRU was designed about 10 years ago as a way to reach a mutual agreement between publishers and libraries about how digital content could be shared and used, but it does not require an actual signature on a legally binding document. Our group offers here a modified version of the SIRU key elements that fit well with these born OA crowdfunded programs. And we're also sharing a template for a slightly more formal memorandum of understanding document that is helpful in other circumstances. So in the middle of the continuum are the OA models such as Subscribe to Open that support a certain amount of open access content in addition to access to paywalled content such as back files, all covered through a single license agreement. And we decided to refer to these models as incentive-based because they provide access to additional content as part of the open access program to encourage participation and funding. If an acceptable agreement is already in place between the two parties, then perhaps a license amendment will be the most efficient approach to reach a final agreement. Or if needed, a complete sample license agreement with the OA components included is also provided here. These models generally don't have any concept of per article charges, and the reports of publishing and authorship are generally available at the program level rather than targeted to individual institutions. And finally, on the far right side of the continuum are the models such as Read and Publish that require detailed and substantial documentation to describe the workflow, the tracking, payment, and reporting involved. Here we provide a full sample license agreement that is drawn from earlier work in the field. We didn't start from scratch, thankfully, and also a shorter license amendment that can be adopted to cover the read and publish details if a main agreement between the parties is already in place. Like the incentive-based models, these agreements include both paywalled and open access content, but they differ in the level of authorship tracking and institutional level reporting that is required to meet the terms of the agreement. So it's certainly our hope that these concepts and sample documents linked to the infographic will be helpful to many smaller and independent publishers who are looking for options to engage in open access in a way that fits with their specific programs. Allowing them to evaluate the cost and the risk assessment and to make decisions about the future. We know no one model works for everyone, and I think our committee certainly hopes that this work will encourage more exploration and experimentation as the open access movement continues to grow. And I think now we move over to Arjan for the workflow.
Yes. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I have no idea.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. My name is Arjan Schalken. I'm working for the Dutch consortium as program manager, and the consortium has 16 read and publish deals, including some medium and smaller sized publishers. But I'm very happy to participate in this project as chair of the working group 4 on workflows. And I think that working group on was very well, worked very hard, and I was happy to see that so many participants of consortia, library publishers, and service providers participated in this working group. Next slide, please, Lorraine. Yeah, so what we did was we looked at the complete, let's say, life cycle, the complete workflow. That's in order to successfully establish and realize an open access agreement. It's important that the consortium and the publisher look at all the workflow phases, from negotiations to implementation and also execution. And of course, this, you can see this as a linear process. Next slide, or part of the next slide, please, Lorraine. Yeah, it's partly a linear process, but there's also a feedback loop. So during the contract, it can become clear that there is an improvement needed, that it needs to be implemented. for example, there is missed OA and the communication should be improved, then that is part of the continuously improvement process within the workflow. But at the end, there's also a feedback loop to evaluate the contract and maybe to look at contract renewal. So this is both a linear and a circular process. Next slide, please. And if you look at all those workflow phases, then you see that there is much information going around, but also that that information can be structured. So there are a lot of information topics. There's contract-related information, there's financial information, information about eligibility, for example, which authors can participate, which journals are part of the deal, which publication types are part of the deal, etc. There's compliance, because these days open access, just open access is not enough anymore. For example, guidelines about licenses or statements of ownerships. And last but not least, there's the process information that needs to be addressed. Where are we in the contract? Is everything going as planned? Next slide, please. So that leaves us we developed, let's say a framework based on those workflow phases and those information topics. And then we challenged ourselves, I think, as a working group to work that framework out in a document to describe every workflow phase and every information tape that's part of that workflow phase, and what are the roles and responsibilities of all parties involved. And where possible, we link to the work of the templates of other working groups, to the work that was already done by ASEC and other parties. So it's also a document that is a starting point to look further than only the workflow itself, but also all the knowledge that is based behind. Next slide, please. And that results in a document with a lot of information. So it's you have to take some time to read it, but also we structured it. You see here some examples of it, and I hope that it's possible for you to also read through the lines. So maybe the next slide can show that. And please, the next one, Lorraine. Then you see that there's a lot of text in our documents, but behind those documents, there's also a lot of data. We are referring to a lot of data. So the document is text, but the information behind it is you can look at it from a data perspective. For example, if you look at participating institutions, that is a list of information that is not only relevant in the negotiation phase, for example, to have an overview of all the articles that are published, ordered by institution, but is also needed in the contract management system, in payment systems, in the contract, in the approval of OA, and also in the reporting. So you see that those kind of information data sets are needed throughout the whole framework, and it's, I think, very interesting to see how can we connect those dots. So. Like I said, the result is a document that is very much information intensive for everybody that hoped that we could draw up some kind of one pager of 10 easy steps to implement the perfect OA deal. I'm sorry, we didn't do that. But at the same time, I hope that with this framework and the document, we are addressing a more complex world. And of course, the question is now how to use that result of the working group. So that comes to the next slide. So first of all, how not to use it? The first not to use it is as a benchmark. It's not that we hope that consortia don't look at this document and say, well, publishers, this is how you have to do it, and just organize yourself, and then after that we started negotiations, or the other way around. So it's not a benchmark. And the second, what's also not, it's not a playing ground. So it's not something that everybody can pick and choose what's shiny, what's in it for me, and work on that regardless what others are doing. Hopefully it's fun to work in it, but you have to do it together. So at least it's, I think, to the step where we are now, and that is, hopefully the result is some kind of a map, and that both publisher, consortia, libraries, service providers have the same map, the same idea of the landscape, know where they are, and then decide what's reasonable to be in the next months, in the next year, in the next 2 years. So work from that, a common ground. And hopefully, and that is the last part, last slide, this is a starting point to connect those dots, the data, the PIDs, the PIDs, the automation, open standards, to connect it like a subway station where you can start at one point and you know where to go to, how to transfer from one provider to another, but still go from A to B in a way that can be that is manageable, that is sustainable, that is cheap, and that everybody can benefit from. So, and I think that is, I hope, also a good introduction for the next speaker, Yvonne, who will address some of the activities that are being done to connect those dots. So Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Arjan, and thanks all the other speakers. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this session. And I was invited to share some real life practical experiences. With the OA Switchboard going live, we have had a true collaborative not-for-profit initiative with research funders, institutions and publishers. And we've done practical implementations with all kinds of different publishers, smaller independent ones. Some only had 100 open access articles per year, larger university presses in transition, pure OA publishers and diamond initiatives. And what I want to do today is actually reflect on some of the practical lessons learned, because they're relevant to all the themes and all the work that the 4 task and finish groups have been doing. And quite a number of the speakers have actually already referred to some of these themes and challenges. Now, if you look at the landscape for a researcher, if they go from an assigned grant all the way through publication and post-publications, in dealing with research funders, publishers and institutions, and all the phases they go through, and all these institutional stakeholders working on that process and supporting it, there is multiple systems in use throughout the publication workflow. And I think we all know that. I would like to illustrate what that leads to and where especially the authoritative source of certain data fields is actually residing. All right. So obviously submission and peer review systems, and I do want to mention explicitly there that in the reporting and in the data needed to make deals, whether you're small or large, or whether you're checking on whether policies are being implemented, the submission date of a manuscript to a journal is quite a critical date. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the source for that specific data field is, or the authoritative, the ultimate source, the original source is the submission peer review system. Next. Then, skipping a couple of steps in the workflow, but when it comes to the content distribution system, or actually the version of record, as it is relevant for many, again, of these cases, policies and deals and what have you, what is really in the version of record is embedded in the JETS XML, the underlying JETS XML, the version of record, the PDF, or whatever technical format is posted and being published. And what is relevant there, and often not in any other system, is the actual listing of the authors. So which one is first, which one is second, which one is fifth. And it doesn't have to mean that the first one is the corresponding author. So that's another important flag that needs to come from the ultimate version of record. Also license type. In our implementations, we've often ran into and thought being pragmatic was going with a journal level default value. People often say, oh, this journal is CC BY. But then when you look a bit deeper, it's not a guarantee that 100% and all articles are CC BY. So again, if you look for the real value of that metadata field on an article level, you have to look at what is in the version of record. Thanks, Lorraine. And Jen, in all these reporting requirements and the data sheets that have already been looked at also today, there's often data that are in none of these systems whatsoever because they're actually journal level master data. So for instance, is this journal regarded pure OA or hybrid or transformative? Is the journal in the DOAJ, yes or no? You don't find that information in the JETS XML. You don't necessarily find it in the submission peer review system. Often publishers have their own journal master data systems. So if we go to the next, now when it comes to reporting on deals, what you really want is to immediately know when an article is being published, to get an alert that it's done, but also get standardized output and get it in a structured data format, fed straight into existing systems. And the most important thing, as in the header and referred to by the other speakers, is PIDs. So ORCID, DOI, ISSN, and very, very crucial when striking deals, if we go to the next, Lorraine, is the institutional identifier. If you go to the next slide, yeah, so all these systems, all these data, and we primarily looked at it on the Switchboard for reporting purposes, but as being part of this project and talking about it, we realized that if you want to start a negotiation, if you want to make an OA deal in the first place, you actually need exactly all that same information on historical content published to have an idea of what you're looking at and what makes sense, and even more. Also post-publication information, like for instance, event usage stats. And what we've learned, again, in our project, in our initiative, is that more and more publishers are looking for a place to bring these data together. And you can give it all kinds of names, data lakes, event-based metadata, but basically to have a place that you know the value of certain metadata at a certain point in time throughout the publication workflow. But really for reporting, but also to inform OA deal negotiations, you would need these kind of data, and the PIDs and the interoperability are crucial. That is lesson number 1. I think that's on the next slide. So critical for solving real problems, and in this case, deal making. And once you have a deal, reporting, PIDs and article level metadata. And if you ask me, the most critical one is institutional identifier for the affiliations of the authors. And number 2, clearly identifiers for the research funders of the underlying research. And then, as I illustrated with these visuals, interoperability, what we've learned is that sometimes some of these critical PIDs are actually in some of these systems, but if the manuscript flows through the publication process, some of these critical and crucial data are getting lost and don't make it all the way through to version of record. So this is big lesson number 1. Lesson 2 is to make it even more complicated. On the next slide, we've learned that there's actually 2 parallel tracks. One is obviously the publication workflow, the research and content workflow, but then there is another one which is going on in parallel, and there is a need to exchange data, no surprise, between those tracks. So matching in case of a deal, in case of no deal and finding funding for an APC, but even in case of diamond, if there is no direct relationship between funding and an individual article, there is a need to match these 2 parallel tracks and exchange data. On the next slide, I'm introducing 2 new systems that we've come across as being relevant here. CRM systems, sometimes as simple as a spreadsheet in which the publisher keeps track which institutions, which consortia they have deals with. And again, then linking that to institutional identifiers, the duration of the deal, maybe which journals are included. So CRM systems, or whatever you want to call it, but the place where the deal information is being kept. And the second one in this case is actually the billing collection, the e-commerce systems, to really, again, have the authoritative data from source on the article level financials. So on the next slide, the second lesson is there is a need to exchange metadata between these tracks, and currently there's lack of interoperability between the relevant system. Lesson 1 is that there is these 2 tracks we've clearly came to realize, and the second one is that also sort of vertically between the publication workflow systems and the financial systems, there is a need for interoperability. Then lesson 3 is just posted on the next slide in the summary. What we've learned, and that is a bit of a challenge, so to speak, and we have to find practical ways to deal with that. If you're talking to workflow people, and you're talking to one here, you would hear us say, oh, solve and fix things, do things as early in the workflow as possible, because then you can benefit downstream. And that is true. That makes a whole lot of sense. But if you're dealing with researchers who are submitting their manuscript and going through the process, none of us, and especially none of the publishers who are supporting them in their publication process, wants to make their life difficult by asking even more questions and making the submission process even more challenging. So this is something we don't have an answer for. We do see different approaches, and we have a lot of conversations to exchange lessons learned and experiences here. These were my lessons. If you want to discuss in more detail, feel free to get in touch, and I hope this was useful for this larger project to share some practical insights from the Switchboard.
Yvonne, that was so useful. Thank you very much indeed. And now, as the final part of the presentation, before some panel discussion, I'm going to share with you some feedback that we got last week at the Researcher to Reader conference in London. We had a breakout group that was focused on this project that you've been hearing about today. It was facilitated by Judy Russell, the Dean of Libraries at the University of Florida, and me. And we were really seeking to get some understanding about how best we can all collectively support the number of open access agreements scale up between libraries, consortia, and smaller independent and other publishers. And so similar to today, we worked at a high level through the outputs of the 4 task forces. And then the group really focused in on the data piece of this puzzle, actually coming to some sort of standard approach to what information needs to be exchanged and how. It feels like the first step forward in being able to scale more of these agreements in the alignment with the principles that have been developed and example agreements that can be entered into. And in brainstorming what possible next steps there are for moving forward, the group, which was a mixture of librarians, publishers, and intermediaries, identified these sorts of things. First off, seeking broad endorsement for the data template that Claire presented earlier would be really powerful, particularly if that came from thought leaders and influencers in both the library and the publishing communities. Second, we've heard repeatedly today that PIDs, orchids, RORs, or Ringgold identifiers or other institutional identifiers, the funder ID, are critical, and ensuring that those are captured early in the article submission process and flow through to the final published article. There's a need to educate researchers themselves about why they're asked to provide this information and how important it is that it's provided and that it's correct. There was a real encouragement to work with those identifier managers and also peer review system providers and other service providers to agree on that standard data template and how to implement that across different systems and to make sure that they can exchange information. And it was felt that really prioritizing data going forward, rather than worrying about that data lake and trying to clean older data, really focusing on the introduction of PIDs into our ecosystem and making sure those flow throughout the article life cycle for articles from 2022 and going forward would be a realistic starting place. There's always a tension in developing standards, recognizing that if they're too rigorous, it's hard to get agreement on them, but they need to be sufficient to be usable. And this is where that survey and the work of Claire Moulton's data group really comes into play. And again, just that point, focus first on the author provided data, capturing it and transmitting it. And then a final suggestion from this group was to clarify the metadata with the taxonomy to ensure that everyone understands what's requested in the data template and can provide it. Okay, and with that, Lorraine, let me hand back over to you so we get some discussion and more interaction. I'll stop sharing the slides.
Thank you very much. Now, I hope our speakers haven't gone away, and perhaps they might, oh, that's lovely, turn themselves, or not turn themselves on, turn their cameras on, so that they're all here. So great to see you all, and thank you for those really brilliant presentations. We're going to hand over more widely a little bit later in this event, but really this is a chance, because you've all been so involved in this, to really pick your brains and discuss some of those things that we've touched on today. And I suppose the first thing to ask you from your different perspectives, it is about these transformative open access agreements, because we are talking about a lot of work and so on. So, and you really cover very different perspectives across all your work. So are they here to stay? Do we need to do all this work?
Yeah, can I address the topic? I hope you can see me, Lorraine.
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting question, and for example, when you have more in general OA funds, do you still need an agreement? I think that agreements are here to stay, but that more the nature of the agreement could change. I think until now, agreements are mostly focused on open access as a product. So who can make use of the product? How much do we still have? Who is going to pay for the product? But the complexity, and that was already, for example, very well presented by Yvonne, is that it's more not only a product, it's also a service, and it's also about the quality of the service. And so it's also about is it published compliant? What to do if you have to repair missed OA? If there is an issue, you have paid for a publication, but it's still not open yet, or even the journal is transferred and somehow the licenses have been changed. And that are all aspects that you don't want to ask the author to manage. That has to be done by the consortium. And then you can have two options, or you have some kind of a license, some kind of agreement on article basis where all this is covered. Or you say, well, should we do this for every single publication? No, we have 50, 100, thousands of those articles a year. So the consortium and the publisher agree on some kind of an agreement, but it's more about the service and less about the product. So that is my 2 cents.
If I can add to what you said, Arjan, yeah, thanks for the question, Lorraine. I think I'd agree with pretty much everything you said there. I think, you know, we have at the moment transitional agreements, transformative agreements, and I think they really are something that's useful for the exact moment in time we're at. You know, the world is moving from a mostly subscription-based system to what will quite soon be a mostly open access system, and they're a very good mechanism for managing that change in an orderly, structured way that kind of preserves good things in the research communication system. I would hope, you know, if you look into the crystal ball and you look 10 years into the future, that we'll end up with rather different agreements in future, which will have evolved from the agreements we have at the present. Speaking as a publisher, we have APC-based journals, and we have one completely diamond open access journal. We've got 10 subscribed to open journals. Over time, we would like the read and publish agreements we have to all evolve so they can accommodate all of those journals, and we end up with a different form of you know, transformative agreement that we might give a different name to in future, but which will enable open access publishing and have some principles in there which allow a fair allocation of pricing for librarians, for publishers, based on what's published, based on how much it's read, and we have some rules for that. That's somewhere in the future. You know, I think that's ahead of where we are. But I think, you know, we have in a short space of time made fantastic progress to move to having transformative agreements. And I think this exercise is a really, really nice way of accelerating that change and making it easier for more publishers to participate in it.
Thank you, Rod. Claire, Yvonne, Celeste, did you want to come in on this question at all?
Yeah, so I very much agree about this is about transformation. So I think the exact nature of the agreements, we don't really know what that will be in the future. But sort of maybe to say a little bit more on Rod's point, I think that there are a number of publishers that have worked really hard to to get these transitional agreements in place. We've had to expand our sales team. Pretty much everybody in the organisation has had to get involved in some aspect of this work because it has been so manual and time consuming. And we've made really great progress, but we certainly haven't reached all of the institutions with our agreements. And there are many other publishers who haven't even started this process. And so I think that there are lots of people who've made a great deal of progress, but there really is a lot of work still to be done. And I think that anything that we can do to help people to move them along this route, because we are all at different points in this journey, and whether this journey is 5 years, 10 years or whatever, I think that there's a lot of work to be done right now to help people set off on that journey.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And of course, that's what this project is about. It's about helping people start that transition by making these agreements and so on.
If I could add, sorry, just one more point, Lorraine, thank you. What you just said, Claire. I think also, the point about trying to make the workload less for everyone involved is a really significant point. I think in the past, perhaps what publishers and librarians have done is have many versions of the same conversation going on in parallel, which is just the way it needed to be for various reasons in the past. I don't think it needs to be that way in future. I think multi-year agreements, have a lot of potential to allow us to talk periodically, agree the rules for partnership and for pricing and for collaboration, and then trust that those rules will work for a period of years, and allow librarians to get on with being librarians and consortium managers to be consortium managers and publishers to be publishers. I do think that's important, and I do think the streamlining part of this project, thinking of the workflow components that Arjan was talking about the data template that Claire was talking about, I think those really are important as well. And if we can find ways to reduce the amount of work everybody has to do to get to agreements, I think that's a real win for everyone involved, and we can actually spend a bit more time focusing on our day jobs rather than having these fantastically complicated agreements that take 18 months to 2 years to agree, and you need an army of salespeople to be able to achieve. So I think there's a real promise in getting more from transformative agreements in future.
Thank you, Rod. I'm going to move us on to another question, and I can see Alicia is chatting away in the chat, encouraging all the people on the call to put in their questions if they have any thoughts for the panel. So please do. I'm going to ask the panel a few questions. But yeah, if you've got questions for the panel, please do send them through the chat, and we'll endeavour to answer them, I hope. So just moving on a little bit, I think the panel have said yes, these agreements are here to stay. That they're not going to stay the same; they're going to change. But this is definitely the world we're in. But we've also talked a little bit about this question of automation and making this a scalable thing. So it'll be really interesting, and you've all delved into these different aspects of the agreement, to hear your views on how automation might be able to help, as you say, Rod, allow people to get back to their day jobs a bit, and take some of the heavy lifting out of this work.
Well, I would like to speak up and just put in a big plug for the
Please.
PIDs, particularly the orchids and the roars for the institutional identifiers. Seconding everything I've heard Yvonne say recently, just the crying need across all of the various types of models, from the more simple ones to the more complicated ones, the need to identify the institutions and the author affiliations is paramount, really, and the library community is just as passionately interested in that as the publishing community is. So I would think anything that we could do to facilitate the adoption of these PIDs would just get us light years ahead of where we are right now.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, Celeste. I'm sure you're right. I can see Yvonne has her hand up because you've mentioned PIDs. I'm sure she wants to.
Yeah,
join
definitely.
in.
And thanks, Celeste, for making that point. That is indeed where it starts. And the second, as I mentioned, but so critical, is just to keep it in the systems, right? So first of all, to capture it early on, ideally, and then this interoperability, even within the publisher's own landscape, is critical. One lesson learned that I didn't talk about in my slides, but relevant here, is that there is, and you talk about automation, Lorraine. I mean, there is open source technology, and there is solutions out there to get from free text affiliations to PIDs. And please come to talk to me if you're interested. Again, it's open source, available to everybody. And this is because things are progressing, because as I mentioned with my third challenge, lesson learned, the tension between author experience and ideal workflow is a real one. So the good news is that people try to find solutions, right, to get from a textual affiliation, even early on in the workflow process, to a persistent identifier. So that is another lesson I wanted to add, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you. While I've still got you, before I move on to Rod, just one other question, which Robert's just put into the chat. I don't know if you saw it, Yvonne. He asked a good question, I think. And he says, given that most articles have multiple authors, how can orchids be accurately captured for all authors? Any thoughts on that multiple author? Because that is another facet which makes this more complicated, doesn't it?
Definitely. I don't know, Rod, if you mean to capture the orchids of multiple authors in the systems, you mean?
But Robert
or to
asked that. Robert,
Robert,
you might want to come in and clarify.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks. So I was assuming, let's assume an article has 10 authors. There's one corresponding authors and 9 other authors. It's reasonable to assume that the submission system can interoperate with ORCID to validate the 16-digit number is correct. But what about the other 9 authors on the paper? And I really, really hope that we wouldn't ever get to a position where the corresponding author is expected to manually key in 9 lots of 16-digit numbers. That sounds like a nightmare. So how do we get all those other ORCID IDs into the system?
Yeah, that is a nightmare, Robert, absolutely. And again, in that space, one is, I mentioned, getting from a free text affiliation to a persistent identifier technology is progressing in that space. And the other one also, in very close coordination with ORCID and also institutions who verify the ORCIDs of their researchers in the ORCID database. There's an increasing number of institutions who do that. Then there is also a way to get that going. So the answer is APIs and interoperability, and indeed, if you have some key somewhere, you can get to another. This is second best. Again, as a workflow person, I would say you do want all these ORCIDs and raw IDs entered. That's not realistic. So it's work in progress, Robert, I would say, and please join these developments, because we're quite fast and in a collaborative spirit, finding solutions to relieve the researcher. That's the key, right? Not to put the burden on them. But work in progress, sorry.
Thank you. I've got some more questions coming in, but I'm just going to go back to Rod for a moment, who's patiently had his hand up.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to make very similar points to what Celeste and Yvonne have said about the PIDs and institutional identifiers like RAWs and Ringgold affiliations. I think automation is a fantastic thing to aim for. I think it's a few steps ahead of where we are. I think there's some more practical nuts and bolts work we want to do first. You know, I mean, just speaking as a publisher, there are several different places where, for instance, institutional identifiers would appear in our workflows. We don't capture that information in a consistent way at this point. We are talking about how to do it, but there's definitely an exercise that needs to be done for publishers to look at their data from that perspective, look at the metadata they capture, and then start cross-referencing that with the actual institutions themselves, for instance, and make sure the same data corresponds in both places. And I think, you know, that would probably need a mechanism, something like Counter, for usage of journals in universities and in libraries, you know, where there are sort of rules for how information is recorded and how it's checked periodically. I think that the key things at the beginning are to get the metadata right, which is the point of things like the PIDs and the RAWs, and then build some mechanisms which give people trust that that information is correct, and a library can rely on information from a publisher. And we don't get a situation, which I think probably came up in Claire's group a few times, where a publisher in good faith comes along with one set of data and the university or the library in good faith has a different set of data, and they spend a very long time comparing the two sources of data and working out why there are small differences between them, getting different outputs. I think we want to take all that out, get those basic principles in, and then I think, you know, with good ways of having hygienic, good data being collected for all articles and being shared between interested stakeholders, I think then it becomes a very practical and very interesting task to work out how do you automate it, what are the feeds, which systems need to talk to which. I think all these things can be done quite quickly. There's a logic needed, but yeah, absolutely, it starts with good data.
Thanks, Rod. I'm going to ask Tom Demaranville, I hope I haven't pronounced your name correctly, Tom, has quite a long question in the chat. Do you just want to show yourself, Tom, and just ask the panel your question?
It wasn't a question, sorry, it was a response to something that's been said on the panel, where we were talking about how do we get ORCID IDs for co-authors and collaborators during the manuscript submission. And there's actually a defined workflow for that several of the manuscript submission systems do already implement. So I just thought I'd throw that out there, that we can do this through collecting email addresses for collaborators and joining up via APIs, and people granting permission, we can join it all up there and collect all the IDs for all the authors on a manuscript. So it's possible, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's definitely possible right now.
Brilliant, thank you. And oh, sorry, I was just going to, oh, sorry, you go ahead. No, okay. I was just going to, Chris, do you want to come in on that comment that you've talked about in the chat there about, right? Maybe he's gone.
Can I make a quick comment? I'm sorry if I'm jumping in, Lorraine. So agree with what's been said about the getting the as much data as possible, and what Tom said, I think, just now. As far as getting the orchids in, and what Robert Kiley was saying, if you've got many authors, in our review system, peer review system, and I'm sure in other peer review systems, you can set it up so that every author is mandated to come in and log in with their orchid. So we get the orchids from the authors themselves automatically, and that's important. So you don't have a third party putting in the orchids. Just wanted to put that in. Thank you.
Yeah, well, just a question on that. I mean, does that work well, or do you find that, I mean, some papers have so many co-authors, I can imagine that might be a bit of a struggle sometimes to corral all your co-authors.
Well, you can say it's up to the publisher. If you say that, let's face it, each author, if you want to make sure that each author did actually contribute, they'll all get an email as long as you've the corresponding author has put their email in. They will get an email. They'll log in, and they have to log in through their orchid, and automatically they are then an author on that. So it's simply an email notification to them, and then coming in and logging in. So there's not much hassle there. And when you've got, say, 20 out of 20, the system moves it on and says, right, it can now be submitted. Otherwise, it can't be submitted, depending on whether the publisher wants that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. And oh, Judy, yes, you were just picking up on one of those comments that was at the Researcher to Reader conference workshop, again about the orchid. Would you like to pop up and ask the panel or talk to the panel about that?
Sure. It was one of the things that surprised me in one of the workshop sessions that, you know, we were advocating, as I do regularly, for ROR and ORCID and these other IDs. And somebody said they had had instances at their company with duplicative ORCID IDs being established because it was easier to go grab a new one sometimes than to find the one you already had and use it appropriately. So there's no good deed that goes unpunished, right? But it doesn't reduce my agreement with everyone here that we absolutely need the ORCID IDs. It's just, as Alicia summarized from the workshop, we need to do a better job educating the researchers about how important that is, and that they need to hang on to that the way they would hang on to their social security number and use it, you know, and not duplicate it when that's easier than going and looking it up, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think, and it would be interesting to hear perhaps from some of the publishers on the call as well, if they would like to talk to this. But you know, Judy made the point here that we do need to educate the researchers and explain why this data is so important. But one of the things that we did touch on in the workflows task and finish group was this tension between an understandable tension between gathering data at that point of submission and so on, but then the risk is that you make it you know, such a high barrier that you actually turn authors away from that particular journal. Claire, I can see you're nodding there. Would you like to talk about that? Because that is a
I thought that was a really important point that Yvonne brought up, and you know, and I think that that's illustrated by the information that Judy's then had about duplicating orchids. And I think, you know, it's that difficulty that, you know, when you submit to a journal, you're not even guaranteed that you're going to be accepted into that journal, and you're asked to give all of this information, and it's like, you know, and then you know, 5 days later you get an editorial rejection and you have to then go to another journal and start the whole process again. So I'm sure that there are also some workflow ways to get around some of that. But it's very frustrating for an author, and a number of publishers like us have switched the data gathering to a later stage. So when you come in at submission, format free submission, fewer data points that you have to put in, and then when you've gone through peer review and then you've been told, okay, we're going to accept your manuscript if you do these following revisions, that's the point at which you then start to ask for a lot more data to be added. You know, and also coming back to this education about identifiers, I think, you know, I remember when I did my first orchid, when I was publishing an article, and I was like, yes, I've got my orchid, got it into the article, very proud of myself. Second article, couldn't remember what my orchid is. I totally see the temptation to just go and make a new one. And I had to search around because I thought, as a publisher, I can't do that. I've got to do this the proper way. And I had to search around to find out what, you know, what my ID was. And so I think it's about educating and getting people used to using them regularly. So publishers don't like to be the first ones that make everybody do something annoying. So what we did was we said the corresponding author has to give their orchid. And if the author doesn't have an institutional email address, then I'm going to need an orchid. But other than that, we didn't want to annoy them too much. And when all publishers ask for all of the authors to have all of the IDs, then it would be okay, because people will be more frequently using them and publishers won't feel that they're sticking out as being more difficult to submit to than their competitors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose in a way it's always very difficult to be first, isn't it? But I can see that Rod has his hand up. So did you want to come in, Rod?
Yeah. I mean, I'd echo what you're saying there, Claire. I'd also make the point that I think the stage we're at, it's, you know, what we're looking to work out is what's the minimum set of data that we can move forward on this kind of, you know, journey towards automating these systems. And, you know, at some point in the future, getting orchids for all corresponding authors or all authors, you know, will be a good thing to have. I'm not sure it's something we need immediately, and I think there's perhaps some discussions to be had, you know, around that minimum set of data, and I know that will have been a topic in your group, Claire, a great deal. But we'll work out what is the good core minimum set of data that we need. How do we validate that data? How do we make it easy to gather? How do we make it trustworthy for everyone within the system? And how do we use that then as the basis for a first iteration of, you know, automatable systems, and then move on to thinking, okay, where are the more complicated use cases? And we don't, you know, allow ourselves to get sidelined by thinking, okay, how do we get orchids for every author, and then find the problems of getting orchids for perhaps a sort of subset of authors becomes a more complicated challenge than actually following through and getting the benefits of automating and getting these systems to talk to each other.
Yeah, and I think that perhaps goes a bit back to that comment that Alicia had about maybe we don't need to focus too much on cleaning up, you know, the past data, that we focus on yeah, getting it right going forward and so on. Right, we've got so many messages in the chat. I'm trying to make sure I give everyone a voice here. Well, I'm gonna go to Alex, because Alex says this project is fantastic. So thank you, Alex. But I think you're highlighting another issue here, which is around the complexity, and perhaps how do systems really deal with this when you have both you're asking what publishers and librarians doing when there are two corresponding authors at different institutions, both have an agreement with the publisher. I think you can only have one corresponding author really, but Alex, but perhaps you have an example of what you're talking about. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure, yeah. We do have a couple of instances where we've had two institutions. We have two co-corresponding authors in our papers, and we allow that.
Sorry, Alex, where are you from?
Sorry, I work at the Microbiology Society.
Oh, right.
So we have quite a few agreements with many institutions now, and we have come up against instances where, for example, one with Birmingham and one with Exeter, and we have two co-corresponding authors. And so, you know, we really have to, we haven't figured that out yet, and it'd be really interesting to, for the long term, what other publishers would do, and whether that should be including in the licensing agreements right from the get-go, or whether we should put that on the author and sort of say, you know, when you submit, the only corresponding author has to be the first, or, you know, what rules can we put around this, and other best practices?
Can I actually reflect on that from the experience of the Dutch consortium?
Please do.
I see several publishers that have indeed where you have multiple corresponding authors, and then we go look at the submitting corresponding author. So that is an additional specification, and I think that's also not a real problem. It becomes a problem for a consortium if multiple corresponding authors is becoming a trend, and then teams are looking at which corresponding author has the most favorable deal, and then suddenly output is shifting from one consortium to another based on strategically choices within the publication process. So that should be prevented, but that there may be multiple corresponding authors, then look at the submitting corresponding author. I think that's something that can be worked out.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was quite wrong here, because I can see Yvonne and many others are telling me instances of co-corresponding authors is quite common, so I didn't realize this.
Yeah. Maybe to add on that one more note, it would also be interesting if there are two corresponding authors and both have a deal, that maybe part of the finance is paid by one consortium and the other part is paid by another consortium. I think that is also will be very interesting and challenging.
Yeah, and Martin Wolf here is saying that it's not an unusual thing, and probably why Wiley have introduced the idea of RCA, the responsible corresponding author. Martin, do you want to come in on that at all?
Yes, so obviously I don't work for Wiley, but there is a lot of chat on our mailing lists related to what Wiley have done, because I'm assuming it's to address exactly this problem. The issues of corresponding author and deals can almost sometimes veer into like an ethical situation, because sometimes we have actually found ourselves having to say to authors that, you know, if someone else was the corresponding author, we would be able to pay for this. So you don't really feel like you want to be putting groups of authors in a position where, oh, the PhD from the one institution who was going to have this as their first corresponding author paper can't be the corresponding author, because to pay for the publishing, then this established academic at another institution has to say that they're the corresponding author. So it is a big issue. But what Wiley have done is they've introduced the idea of the responsible corresponding author, who is the author who's responsible for all of the correspondence between the authors and Wiley themselves, and that it will be the responsible corresponding author's institution who's liable for it to come from their share of a consortium deal or to publish, right? So obviously they must have done that because they're seeing more papers with more than one corresponding author. So they've created a whole new class of the responsible corresponding author to deal with that.
Really interesting. I didn't know about that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think Rod wants to come in.
Yeah, I like the idea of a responsible corresponding author, which kind of begs the question of the irresponsible corresponding author is the other party in the system. I don't think we have this system, you know, and maybe I'm saying something which somebody in our publishing company will be sort of shouting at a screen saying no, of course we do, but I don't think I see it. And I think for me these are some of the really interesting detail questions for next stages in the journey. And I suspect, Lorraine, you'd know more about this than me, but in Project Counter, you know, there are perhaps similar kind of discussions about what counts as valid usage, what's the sort of genuine download at a university, and there's going to be presumably quite a few questions like this that really need to be teased out and get sort of qualified groups of people together to look at different kind of, you know, sort of edge cases and work out, you know, how do we deal with this case, you know, multiple corresponding authors, what are the rules for that, and formalize those. And I think at root it comes back to one of those, you know, these kind of basic trust questions, that if everyone can see what the rules are for how decisions are made and people are happy with those rules, they seem fair, then I think we can manage these cases and have a sort of good system which people buy into.
Well, you know me, Rod, I'm all for rules and codes of practice and so on. So I can definitely see this. I'm just looking at our chat to see. Oh, Robert says, I dread to think what happens when there are multiple responsible corresponding authors. So thank you, Robert, for terrifying that with that future nightmare. And Yvonne, I don't know if people have noticed, Alicia asked a question, I'm losing my thread now, about the raids. Am I pronouncing that right? Raids? And the DOIs issued by the funders. Did you just want to come in on that, Yvonne? Because that sounds quite an interesting thing, and I had no idea about it either.
Yeah, and I was actually just, thanks Lorraine, going to say I would recommend start with first things first. Can we please start with institutional identifiers for authors' affiliations? Then second, sorry, research funders, but second, do the PIDs for the research funders of the underlying research. And if we got that basically in place and our lessons learned, we can think about other challenges. Because as in my exchange with Robert, I think the reality is that we'll have to sort of combine, use different sources, different smart matching, different APIs, as Tom from Orchid was also saying, to deal with the fact that you're not going to get everything from source, from the author from the start. So, and I see that progressing. I see, especially if we work together, lessons learned, progress being made in that space. But my recommendation would be, yeah, do that first, because it's critical for deal making, which is the topic of this workshop anyway, Lorraine, isn't it? I mean, you need to know if your author is from UKB, from University of Amsterdam, otherwise Arjan doesn't even want to talk to you, right? I mean, it's the first, in light of OA deal making for smaller publishers, I think this is the most, well, I don't think, I feel strongly, this is the most critical one.
Yeah. I can only agree on that. For example, we have a data hub where we try to manage a lot of DOIs published in the past years from Dutch authors, and we found more than 3,000 institutional names that somehow we try to relate to 70 formal institution names, and that is a lot of work. Service providers and authors come up with different new names every day. As long as this is free text or separately designed taxonomies, then we still keep on managing this with a lot of effort. So I think, yeah, the one idea raw or an idea is very important for the institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like the idea of you refusing to speak to people otherwise. I think that's Yvonne's point was very good. I see you've got Biblop waiting to come in. Would you like to ask your question? You had your hand up for a while.
Hi, I'm sorry, it's not my question actually. My name is Biplab and I'm the founder of Waymetrics. It's another vendor-like OA agreement to process workflow for ABC. So I really echo with Yvonne about the importance of the properly writing author affiliation. We have implemented so many process to find the correct affiliation for the author. Despite all of the efforts, we continuously see author writes very differently their affiliation, which create a huge issue automating the identifying author, applying whether there is a deal, if there is a discount, or there is a read and publish. What I would say is to all the publishers and institutions is that we really need to educate researcher instead of looking into ORCID first. If the author do not put the affiliation correctly, that creates a lot of problem, and it is important. That was my just little bit from my experience, what I do daily, looking into author, that why our system cannot or did not manage to find the author affiliation automatically. Despite we use machine learning, we use regex to identify, we implement one single institution, probably 20 ways of their name, but despite every day we see author changing or writing differently their affiliation name. So that is my experience from the Waymetrics. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's a really, really good point. And I must add, I have come across that myself, that for some strange reason, authors aren't always quite sure about where they're from or how to spell it. So very good point. And I'm just going to ask Claire, because Alicia mentioned that this was another thing that you talked about, Claire, in your working group on gathering that data, wasn't it? And I think focusing on the the emails, institutional emails. What would you like to tell us a bit about background about that discussion and where you got to?
Yeah, so I think it comes from two angles. I think actually the librarian also wants to be able to contact the author and talk to them about their publishing. So I think that they wanted to be able to identify the exact author. So, really an institutional email address rather than a Gmail or whatever. They can usually then track down which department they're from. There may be a pot of APC money that's relevant or something like that. So it was really about having, you know, information about the authors in their own institution and being able to identify where they came from and what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly is quite a difficult one. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. I'm also going to just look at the comment that Charla has just made, and I know it's something that came up on all the task and finish groups actually, and that's about how this work continues, how we build, you know, on the work that Claire and all the other task and finish groups have done. And Charlotte says, well, what are the new, what are the next steps for this project? We're very pleased, Charlotte, that we have ALPS are going to host the outputs of the task and finish groups on its website. So there will be a home for the outputs of these groups. But then you also go on to say, are there plans to engage the smaller publisher and library consortia communities so that all of the output remains relevant as the landscape continues? Well, I think we really are at the end of this project, unfortunately, and it would be wonderful actually to share in person with our working groups. Robert, I don't know if you want to address that comment at all, because it has come up a couple of times in the chat.
I think, as you said, we're coming to the end of this project. We at Coalition S are, you know, we are trying to be agnostic about which models we support. So we're always very conscious that as soon as we do something in this space, we get the OA publishers bemoaning us for not supporting them and so on. So I think we are actively supporting this. We have put money behind it. We're delighted, as Lorraine said, that ALPSP are going to host it. I suspect what we and Coalition S are committed to do is review where the impact of Coalition S by sort of no later than the end of 2024, and I suspect that will include revisiting whether or not Plan S has encouraged society publishers to transition, or has it led to some other consequence. So I don't think I'm going to commit today to doing anything beyond what we have done. I think ultimately it's now we've hopefully provided some tools, and the real decision whether publishers and consortia want to do deals is between the publisher and the consortia. So we've tried to provide some tools to facilitate that. I think when we come to review the impact of Plan S, we'll look to see what's happened, and if we need to give further support to help society publishers, we can consider that at that point. But I don't think there's anything particular we're going to do now to address that specific bit.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. And Rod, you're waiting patiently there.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Robert. First, I was going to give a shout out to Johann's quite impressive cat, which has got an extremely good sense of balance sitting on your shoulders there. I mean, I hope we can find ways between us, going back to Charlotte's question, to carry this forward. I think there's great merit for everyone in streamlining workflows and making things less ambiguous, make the communication about who an author is and where the author is based clearer. I think also, if you think of perhaps some of the transformative agreements that exist, the project deal agreement with Wiley sort of springs to mind. I think some agreements do have an awful lot of need for administration, which takes a great deal of human hours to fulfill the agreements and to monitor and to administer those agreements. And one of the principles that comes up over and over again in these kind of conversations is, how can we make a change without adding total cost to the system? And I think some of the changes we've made have brought in significant additional administrative costs, and those might be within library consortia, they might be within libraries or other parts of the university, they might be within publishers. But I think there is a very strong incentive that if we get these workflows and we work out the right PIDs and RAWs and other identifiers that need to be passed from one system to another system so they travel cleanly all the way through the process. I think there is potential to save significant amounts of money that are being spent at the moment in different parts of the system, and allow that money to be spent more constructively on, you know, what are the right resources, and, you know, what should the library be focusing its attention on. So I think there's, you know, a very strong case for carrying on what we're doing, finding a different way to do that. And if, you know, Coalition S and ALPSP and other groups can get behind and help facilitate that, I think that's fantastic. And I think there is also a strong economic case for reducing the amount of cost that is currently being spent on administration, which is necessary, but perhaps not particularly productive in many places.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you very much. I'm going to now sort of turn to our audience because I think you just summed that up so brilliantly. And I don't quite know how to do this. We haven't really got a poll, but maybe people could show their hands or jump in and speak. We have talked about automation a lot, and as Rod said, you know, that there are a lot of costs involved in this new world, both for the publishers and for the libraries and for the library consortia, and possibly automation may be a way forward. I just wondered generally across everybody here, maybe you could put your hands up, not your real hands, obviously, your hands in Zoom, if you have a desire to see more automation in this space. Oh, well, Claire does anyway. But well, quite a desire for the automation. Oh yes, thank you, Nels. Thank you. And then the next question for you all, and maybe people might want to, those who would like to see this automation, just what would be your priorities? I mean, we've heard our panel speaking, and I think we've got a good idea from them, but would anyone like to talk about what their priorities would be around automating all of these systems and so on?
Yes, sure, Lorraine. From the perspective, so we have 16 deals, and we hopefully we add some more the next years. And I think that we talked a lot about the negotiation and deal making phase, but I think more and more the energy needs to go to the contract management phase and monitoring phase. And there, I think it's very important to connect somehow a central hub of the consortium with all the reporting and monitoring pipelines of all the individual publishers. So I think there's a lot of effort done now, and so also a lot of things to gain if we can somehow manage that. So APIs through the different reporting systems is I think very important.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Alice, I think this is your priority, is also saying ensuring, or Alice, do you want to come in and speak to it?
Sure, sorry. I wasn't confident to speak because I wasn't able to attend the first part, so I'm sorry if this has been covered. But I think one of the things that would make me slightly hesitant about automating things is making sure that the sources of data that the automation came from was comprehensive for sort of smaller institutions. I mean, I'm at the Royal Veterinary College, and I think with sort of Sherpa Juliet, it doesn't necessarily include the majority of our funders and things. So as I said, I'm sorry if I've sort of
no
what was covered earlier.
This is really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that would be one of your fears, would it? That the sort of the metadata that was relevant to you just wouldn't be included in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think automation's a good thing. I suppose I'm sort of partly thinking of sort of journal checker tool being quite administration heavy. I know it's in beta, but I sort of find myself sort of almost in more conversations with people than I would have been if I'd have sort of given recommendations myself. So, but I completely understand that it's really difficult to do early on, but I just that's sort of what I'd flag, I suppose. Yeah.
Very good point. Thank you. Thank you. And then I'm just going to go back. Claire, oh, PIDs. Thank you. Somebody says PIDs is the priority. So I'm sure many people on the call would agree with that. Claire has asked, and she's had 1 or 2 suggestions, but Claire asked, are there any influencers on the call? Would you like to say, Claire, why that would be really help us and really important?
Yeah, so I guess one of the questions in the chat was whether this is going to be communicated elsewhere, and I'm just, it was obviously discussed at the R2R conference, and there's a session also at UKSG scheduled, but that was the meeting was postponed, so it's just a little bit later. But at the R2R, that was one of the key points that came through, really, was that one of the ways of moving this forward would be to get some key voices in this area to actually endorse the templates, to help promote their take-up. And I just thought we would probably have some of those people on this call.
Well, people have been suggesting other influencers, but I would have stepped up as an influencer. But I'm sure Yvonne noticed that. Right. Well, while you have our wonderful panel, any more questions or thoughts, or are there any questions you've already put which I've ignored because they've come in so fast? Oh, well, actually, there was one from Alicia which I will ask, and that was about the systems vendors. I think we have some system vendors on the call. What sort of business case would you need to see from your customers in order to implement some of these ideas? But while we're waiting for, oh, sorry, hands are up and I failed to notice them. But while you ponder that, we've got Kathy and Alex. So Kathy, would you like to come in first?
So is that Kathy or Carvey?
You're here. We'll go back.
Okay.
You go, and we'll go.
I'm
back
sorry. Yeah. Actually, I'm using a Mac. For some reason, I can't see the raised hand. That's why I can't actually raise my hand. So I don't know if there are other vendors here. So I guess I can be a vendor of included peer review system. I'd say we are very much supportive of what Yvonne is doing, the OA switchboard. Just because there's lots and lots of data, the worst thing you want to do is to go and, as we were talked on the chat, reverse engineer acknowledgement to see where who the funder was. We shouldn't be doing that. So as much data as possible, I would say have a look at mandating orchids. Orchid is a unique ID almost every. I mean, there's no reason why people shouldn't have orchids. If they change institutions, you still have the orchid, and you can have as many people going in and logging in with their orchid. So basically, as much data as possible to not to have to do manual work. And I take Alice's point that some of the data may not be there, for example, in Sherpa, etc. But maybe we should then work at making sure that data is there, so that at the beginning, so that we can automate. So the little point from me. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Oh, that was an old hand that we had up before. I've just learned. So we just had such a very, very rich conversation today, and we covered so many points. It's just been absolutely brilliant. And it's been brilliant to hear the voices of so many different stakeholders as well, and that's been fantastically helpful. So I think I'm going to bring us to a close. We've been going for quite a while. I do want to thank once again our fantastic steering group of this project, and as you can see, everyone on this call can see our task and finish groups who have done just such wonderful work in a short space of time. And also just to remind you, as I said, we're going to just tidy up the outputs that we've mentioned today, and they will be on the ALPS website. And also, as Claire pointed out, if you are able to attend the UKSG conference, we will be talking about it there, and hopefully meet some of you at that conference as well. So thank you very much. Alicia, is there anything else that we need to say before we go?
I think that's a good wrap up, Lorraine. Just to echo that, thanks to Robert, to Rod, to Claire, to Celeste, to Arjan, and to Yvonne for their presentations today that set the scenes. We've saved the chat, we've saved the recording. We'll make those available as well and share with all of you. And if after you've had a chance to reflect, if you have some ideas about how to get started, getting traction with making some of these changes and follow-up points, do please let us know. We're keen to hear from you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks,